Hello, my name is Aviva, and today I wanted to talk about if the books that I read throughout the month of October were actually worth the read or not. The thing is that I read a lot in one month. I'm pretty sure this month I read either 30 or 32 books, somewhere around that number, and obviously I can't fit that all into one video, so I did make a video just like this a couple of weeks ago where I talked about basically all the books that I read in the first half of the month. So if you did miss that and you wanted to check it out, I will have a link for it down in the description below. But either way, today I'm basically just going to be talking about all the books that I read this month that weren't actually in that video. And I will also have some links in the description for all the books that I'm talking about today and the GOODREADS reviews that I had written for them. Because if you're not familiar, if you don't follow me on other platforms, then you might not be aware that every time I read a book, I post a review right away to my stories on Instagram. And then right after that, I'll post it to GOODREADS. And then more or less right after that, I'll post it onto TikTok. So if you follow me anywhere else, you might have already seen some of my reviews for these books. And that is why I'm not going to go repeat myself, because those reviews are very, very detailed and I put a lot of time and effort into them. So if you are actually interested in a specific book that I'm talking about in today's video, you could just go to my GOODREADS review and hear every single thought that I had for it as I was reading it. So today instead, I'm basically more or less just going to tell you what the book is actually about, and I'll go into a little bit detail as to why I think if it's actually worth your time or not. So with that said, let's get into the books. So first up, I wanted to share with you It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey. So this is a book that I said for a very long time that I was never actually going to read. People ask me about this book all the time, like, did you read it? What did you think about it? And I'm like, no, I never read it. I never really wanted to read it. And that is mostly because I have read Tessa Bailey's work in the past before this book came out, and I wasn't really a big fan of it. And I've seen so many reviews about this book and everybody hyping it up, saying that it was one of their favorite books of all time. And I had a feeling it wasn't really going to work for me. So I just never bothered giving it a try. And then for some odd reason, this past month, I decided I wanted to listen to the audiobook of it. And I'm actually very happy that I did that because I ended up pretty much enjoying it. I did give it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. And I would say that this book is more or less worth the read. It didn't end up very much like, impressing me. Like, it was not as good as everybody was saying it was, but I actually thoroughly did enjoy it. And I don't think it's like a horrible book that you should just pass up on, especially if you were actually interested in it. If you're not familiar with it, it is like a Schitt's Creek retelling, even though I've never watched Schitt's Creek to actually know, but I know that a lot of people say that about it. I think even Tessa Bailey herself said that this was actually inspired by Schitt's Creek, but it's basically about this girl who is very wealthy, and one day she gets in trouble. So her stepfather decides to cut her off and teach her a lesson by sending her to her birth father's hometown, this small fisherman town. And she is going to have to just work at the dive bar that she inherited from her father or something like that, fix it up and basically just make her own money and live by herself for a little bit without his credit card sort of thing. And basically when she gets there, she's going to end up meeting a grumpy fisherman, and it's going to end up being their romance. So it's like a small town grumpy sunshine sort of situation with a rich girl and a very down-to-earth sort of guy. And basically it ended up being not that bad. It honestly reminded me of a movie. It kind of felt like I was reading a movie. It kind of had that, I can't really explain it, but if you're very into rom-com movies and you don't mind reading that in a book, then I feel like this book can really work for you. Just the way that it was laid out, and especially the third act conflict at the end, how it was a little bit over dramatized. It felt very movie-ish to me, and I happen to have very much been in that specific mood at the time that I read this book. So I feel like that is why it specifically worked out for me at the time that I read it. So overall, yeah, I'd say it's worth the read if this was something that was originally on your radar and you were just very iffy about it. I'd say it's not worth your time, but honestly, it was not as good as everybody was saying it was, at least in my opinion. And then I did also end up reading the second book in this companion series, which is about the girl from book one's sister and then the boy from book one's best friend. So in book one, these two characters, they originally met and then they kind of become friends. And then at the beginning of book two, you kind of find out that they have been texting for a while ever since they originally met, and they're now somewhat friends. And at the beginning of the story, this girl is basically going to be having to come to their small town for her job. She works for a movie set of sorts, and their set is going to be located in that small town for a while. And the thing is that her sister doesn't really have room for her to stay in at the moment, so she's gonna end up bunking with her sister's fiance's best friend, who happens to be this guy that she's kind of been texting for the past little bit, and they've somewhat become friends. So it's gonna be a forced proximity roommate situation, and obviously they're gonna end up falling for each other. And then another big thing about this book is that he is very much a player. So it's kind of one of those I was a player until I met you sort of things, and he doesn't really think that he deserves her. He thinks I've always been a player, I've slept with too many people, and she's way too good for me, so I can't really be with her, even though I'm obviously extremely attracted to her and I very much am falling for her. So it kind of has a very heavy vibe of that going on in this story, and I think that's one thing that I enjoyed but also somewhat didn't enjoy. I kind of honestly had a little bit of a hard time connecting to both of these characters for a couple of reasons. For the girl specifically, she was very into music, and it was a very heavy topic in this story. And while I kind of liked it, I personally am not as into music as she was, and therefore, because that was like one of her biggest character traits, I had a very hard time at connecting to her specifically. And then the whole big thing about the guy is that he didn't think that he deserved her, so it was very much like back and forth with him the entire time of like, well, I want her, but I don't deserve her, so I'm gonna go for her, and then I'm gonna back away, and all of that sort of stuff. And therefore, I kind of had mixed feelings towards the story because of that. And I feel like just in general, I did not connect to the characters as much as I did for the first book in the series, but somehow I did end up giving it a 3.5 stars overall. And I honestly am not going to go into detail as to why I ended up rating them both equally, even though I didn't necessarily feel the exact same way about both of them. But I will say that if you were very interested, you should check my Goodreads reviews, because I did go into detail there. And also, I still do think that this book was worth the read if you liked book one, and also in general, you were actually interested in reading this book. I did also end up reading A Fate of Wrath and Flame and then A Curse of Blood and Stone by K.A. Tucker. So this is the first and second book in her Fate and Flame trilogy. I believe it's a trilogy. All I know is that the first and second book is currently out. The third book, and I don't know if it's going to even continue after that, that is not out yet. So I decided to read this series anyway, even though I'm not a huge fan of reading like unfinished series, but I've heard such good things about it that I really wanted to give it a try. So if you're not familiar with what it's about, it's basically about this girl who is a jewel thief in New York City. And at the beginning of the book, this woman is going to come up to her and ask her to steal something for her. And more or less, she's going to end up taking the job because she doesn't really have a choice. And then this woman is going to end up sending her to a parallel universe to go and retrieve the thing that she needs to retrieve. So she didn't really agree to this situation, but it's going to end up happening nonetheless. And anyway, when she gets there, she's going to end up being put into this person's body who is not herself. And then it's going to end up being a case of mistaken identity, because the person's body that she was put into just recently killed the king and queen of these lands. So she's now in a lot of trouble, and nobody's really believing that she's not the person that they think she is. And obviously the story is going to end up going from there, and she's going to have to get herself out of this situation, at the same time figure out how to steal the thing that she needs to steal. And then on top of that, she's also going to end up having a enemies to lovers slow burn romance with the prince who just turned king in this land, because she actually like took the body of the princess that was engaged to be married to this guy who just killed his parents. So there's a lot of interesting things going on there, but more or less that is the gist of the story. So honestly, that sounded really intriguing to me, and I was very excited to get into these books, but unfortunately, they did not end up working out for me so much. So I did end up giving the first book a 3.5 stars, but then I ended up giving the second book a 2 stars. So in this book, I had a very, very, very hard time getting into it originally. Like, I'm pretty sure it took me about 100 pages or so just to wrap my head around somewhat what was going on. It was very heavy on the world building and like, you know, setting up the story and everything along those lines. And then on top of that, I wasn't really into the writing style. I was having a very hard time processing all of it. So I had a bit of a hard time getting into it. But then once I actually did, I was very intrigued by the general storyline because it sounds very interesting to me. And I was kind of liking the whole enemy slivers romance aspect of it. Like, they were very much enemies, and I was really enjoying the banter and the tension between the two of them and everything along those lines. So that's kind of why by the end of this book, once the couple got together, I was kind of into it enough to actually continue on with the story. So I ended up going to book 2 right away. And then unfortunately, this one went very downhill. And by the end of it, I wasn't really a fan of the series anymore. So this one had very middle book syndrome where nothing actually happened, and all it did was give us a lot more drama for the couple that was very much unneeded, and it kind of just felt dragged out, and all it was a ton more info dumping and world building and politics and things along those lines, and I just stopped caring about what was actually going on. So unfortunately, I don't think that I would really recommend this series to anybody. I personally did not have a great time with it, so I can't in good conscience say that you'll have a better time with it than I did, but I do know that the series did work out for a couple of people. It's the reason why I decided to pick it up, so take from that what you will. I didn't like it, maybe you will, but I don't think I would personally recommend it to anybody. I also ended up reading this book called Down Comes the Night by Alison Saff. So this is a fantasy romance enemies to lovers standalone with a bit of a mystery. So you're following this girl who is a healer in this kingdom, and they happen to be in middle of war with these other people of sorts. And basically at the beginning of the story, she's going to be sent to this mansion that happens to have a mystery going on where a lot of the people are kind of going missing and getting sick, and they don't really know what's happening. So she's going to have to go to figure it out. And when she gets there, she ends up seeing one of the people that is living in the household that is very sick, and he happens to be the enemy of her kingdom. Like, she recognized that he was like the reaper of wherever he's from, and he basically killed a lot of her people. And she obviously doesn't want to help him, but she's going to do it reluctantly because, you know, she's a healer and she's got to do what she's got to do, sort of thing. And then when she's there, she's going to slowly realize that everybody in this household is kind of getting poisoned, and she's going to have to figure out the mystery of that, and he is going to end up helping her. So it kind of has that natural enemy sliver situation where it's like he's on on one side of this war and she's on the other, and they have reasons to not actually get along, but they're obviously going to slowly fall for each other. And at the same time, they're going to start working together. She's going to figure out how to get in better, and then they're going to obviously solve this mystery slowly but surely. So I honestly had a pretty great time with this book. I ended up giving it a 3.75 out of 5 stars. So I feel like, it was a good time overall. I definitely would recommend it to anybody who was interested in a fantasy romance enemies lovers, a standalone that had a bit of a mystery. I feel like all around the board, it was a pretty solid read overall. Didn't blow me away or anything like that, but honestly, it was worth my time. So because it was October, I kind of really wanted to read something a little bit like dark and atmospheric, just to get myself into that like spooky Halloween sort of vibe. So I ended up picking up Haunting Adeline by H.C. Carlton. So if you're not familiar with this story, you're basically following this girl who had recently inherited this like spooky rundown manor from her grandmother who had recently passed away. And then when she moves in there, she basically finds out that she has a stalker because he's basically like freaking her out and taunting her and everything along those lines. And then you also get to see the stalker's POV. So you find out that he's actually a coder who's trying to take down human trafficking. So there's a lot of stuff going on his end as well. And basically that is more or less where the story starts off. And then it's obviously going to go in some crazy places. The thing is that I never actually got to those crazy places because I ended up DNFing this book halfway through. So the thing is that I did do a lot of research before I decided to pick it up. I looked up all the trigger warnings. I looked up more or less where the story was going. I didn't really care for spoilers. So I kind of found out a lot about it before I actually went into it. And I was still okay with everything that I saw. But then unfortunately, the execution of how all of those things ended up playing out was what was not actually working for me. Like I wasn't really into the writing style. I wasn't really connecting to the characters. I wasn't really enjoying the insta love, insta obsessionist of these stalkers sort of situation. So I wasn't really into the romance, even though I didn't even get to the romance aspect of it before I gave it up. But either way, I wasn't really liking it. I was already halfway through and I just knew that I wasn't going to make it through 1,000 more pages. So I decided to give up on it early, but I do think that it's a book that kind of will work for some people and just won't work for others. And I do recommend, first of all, to do a lot of research into this book before you decide to give it a shot or not. And then also to look up my Goodreads review that I will have linked in the description below, because I do go into a lot more detail as to why this book specifically did not work for me and my personal taste. But I won't necessarily say that this book is not worth the read, because I think that for the right reader, it could be a really, really great time. I just don't think that everybody is that type of reader, and it definitely will not work for everybody. But if you do all of the research and you are okay with everything that it seems like it's actually about, I will say give it a shot, see if you could get yourself into it, especially if you are generally a dark romance reader. But if you're not so into dark romance, I don't think that this is the book that you should start with. And then on a completely separate note, I ended up picking up this book called On the Fence by Casey Wetch, which is a YA romance. So this is a book that was on my TBR for a very long time, and I have been making it a mission to slowly check off all of the books that I currently own so that I could say that I've read the majority of my library. And this is just one of those books that had gotten stuck on my shelves a very long time ago when I was still reading YA, which must have been probably like 2 years ago or so. But either way, I never got around to it, and I finally decided to just like give it a try via audio because I knew that I would have an easier time getting through it that way. And I actually did thoroughly enjoy the audiobook of it, and I will say that it was not that bad of a book. I did end up giving it a total of 3 stars, but that is mostly just because I am not into YA anymore, so I really couldn't connect to the story on the level that I was supposed to connect to it to actually have like thoroughly enjoyed it. But I think for what it really was a pretty solid time. And if you're into YA romances, I think that this isn't a book that you should pass up on if you were interested in it. Like, I think that it was a totally fine time, and I would recommend it to a YA reader. I just am no longer a YA reader, so I personally couldn't give it more than a 3 stars. But if you're not familiar with it, it's basically about this girl who is a tomboy and ends up falling for the boy next door. And there's a lot of like, teen drama stuff that goes on with it. And it's honestly like not that bad of drama. But overall, it was a pretty solid time, very basic storyline, very quick, easy read. And I am not upset that I read it. So yeah, I would recommend it to anybody who is interested in a YA romance. And the last book that I wanted to share with you today is King of Wrath by Anna Hong. So this is the first book in a new one of her series. She's very famous for her Twisted series, which I know a lot of people love, but I've actually said multiple times on my channel that I'm not really a big fan of. I had read the first book in the series and I didn't really like it, so I never thought that I would read anything else by this author. But then happened to be this book came out and I started seeing all of the reviews, and a lot of people were saying that even if you didn't like the Twisted series, this book still might very much work for you. So I decided to give it a shot because you know what, you never know. And I am very happy that I did that because I ended up giving this book a 4.5 out of 5 stars, which was honestly much higher than I expected to give it. But I had a great time with this book. If you're not familiar with with what it's about, it's basically about this girl who is a jewelry heiress, and she's arranged to be married to this very wealthy, like, businessman of sorts. Her father kind of set it up, and basically she's just going to go along with whatever her father wants to make him happy. And the thing is that she is unaware that this guy is actually being blackmailed into this, union of sorts. Like, her father has some like dirt on him, so he basically is being forced into this marriage. So he very much does not like her, does not like the situation, and he's trying to get himself out of it. And she basically does not very much like him because, he's not acting very nice to her, and he's kind of like really annoying to be around. So basically it kind of has that hate to love sort of situation. It has this New York City elite high society sort of vibe to it, and that happened to be something as to why I had a hard time getting into it. I wasn't really liking all of the high society wealthy references of sorts, but it ended up being a very large part of this book. Like, it was kind of just like the vibe of the story. So I ended up getting used to it pretty early on, but basically that's why I kind of had a hard time getting into it at the beginning. And then happens to be by the end of it, I wasn't really a fan of the third act conflict. So that's kind of what brought my rating down overall, because the general idea of the story was that he was like lying and deceiving her because he knew that he was being blackmailed into this, but he never shared that information with her, and it ended up blowing up in his face by the end of it. So that was the one thing that I didn't really love about the story, but I don't think that that's actually a reason not to read the book, because I had a great time with it. I thought that it was just a really, really fun time. There were so many fun scenes and interactions between the couple. I really liked, all of the smut. It was pretty heavy on that if that's what you're into. And then also at the end of the day, I really liked just the way that the romance in general was developed. Like, I really liked the characters. I felt their chemistry right away. I really felt the tension and the banter between the two of them. Overall, I really had a great time with it. And I honestly would say that it is worth a read, even if you weren't a fan of the Twisted series, because I wasn't a fan of it and I still really enjoyed this book. So that is all I'm going to say about that. But either way, with that said, that is everything that I wanted to share with you. I did have a couple of other books that I did end up reading this month, but they were mostly just like rereads. So I'm not really going to go over it here because I have talked about like all of the rest of them on my channel multiple times. But either way, that is all of the new books that I had ended up reading this month that I didn't end up talking about in my last wrap up that I did a couple of weeks ago. So with that said, I am going to let you go. So if you did enjoy watching this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you are not currently subscribed. And either way, thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video. I do hope that I gave you a little bit of better insight towards the books that I share with you today, and hopefully helped you figure out if you wanted to read them or not. So with that said, until next time, enjoy reading.